It's a fiendish spectacle of shocking surgery as new life is given to a man already dead.
Hey guys, what's up? It's Biscuitable Horror Reviews. I'm here with a new video for you. I told you I'd be doing a series on my favorite bad movies of specific decades. First was my favorite bad movies from the 1960s, which was a top 5. This is a top 15 of my favorite bad movies of the 1970s. So, yeah. Oh, damn, am I gonna do it successfully this time? Oh, hell yeah, look at that. Oh, hell, I mean, that's a little bit of a big head on it, but that's not a bad pour. I just want to screen cap this, like, for later. Alright, that's enough of that. Anyway, this is a, this one was a little harder to make because I had, like, 40 bad movies from the 70s that I like. So I narrowed it down to 15 because I figured that'd be a decent round number. For the 80s, this is going to be like a top 50 probably. It's going to be bad. Either way, let's just get this started with number 15.
Rising from his tomb to fill the night with horror.
Alright, starting off at number 15, and also, if anybody's wondering what I'm sipping on as far as beer goes, it is Wild Ohio Mango Tea Beer. It's beer that is brewed with tea instead of hops, so it tastes like tea for the most part. Either way, starting off at number 15 is Zat from 1971, I believe. This is a monster movie from the 70s that not a lot of people like. And to be honest, yes, it is a little bit boring at times. There's quite a few scenes of conversations that are just too much. But I featured this on my list of top 10 favorite so bad it's good movies I did like 2 years ago. And on that list I featured this film. This is a movie about a Nazi scientist who is hiding out in Florida, and he essentially turns himself into a fish man just to prove that he can. And then he goes around stalking girls and killing them and or trying to turn them into fish women so that way he can start his own fish people master race. The costume looks like a bunch of trash bags covered in green spray paint and dried mud. You could tell that the actor in the costume cannot see at all, and it's hilarious to see him stumbling around, especially in the underwater scenes. Like, you honestly feel like the man's going to drown in that costume, and that's really what makes this movie funny. That and the monologue from the mad scientist who is, like, sexually attracted to fish. This is a pretty entertaining movie. It's definitely probably the most niche movie, or, yeah, probably the most niche and or boring movie on the list. As far as, you know, from a actual entertainment perspective goes, but honestly, I really do like Zat. It's a very enjoyable monster movie, and I do highly recommend this movie as well as every movie on this list.
The Bates High School gym is alive with excitement. Everybody is there, even Carrie White.
At number 14, we have The Worm Eaters, the feature film debut from director Herb Robbins, who stars in this film. This is another one that was featured on my list of favorite bad movies of all time. This movie is something special. It was produced by Ted V. Michaels. He put the money towards the project. I want to say because he believed in this project, but it's probably just because why the fuck not? This is a weird kind of horror comedy gross out film, body horror revenge film about about an old German hermit portrayed by director Herb Robbins. He lives in this house that is abandoned. It's lakefront property, and the town wants the deed to the property so they can build a resort there. And essentially the town tries to kill him or get the deed from him. And to get revenge on this town for them trying to swindle him, he puts worms that he has bred in everybody's food And in the movie, you see people eating this food, and there's worms in it, and they're eating as sloppily as possible, eating live worms mixed in with hot dogs and chewing tobacco and other things. And the close-up is on their mouth as they're eating. It's a pretty gross film in that regard. But in all honesty, he breeds these worms that, when eaten, turn people into worm people. It's bizarre as hell. The humor is like honestly, if you were to show this movie to an audience of like millennials who grew up on a mixture of Tim and Eric, and like Xavier Renegade Angel, you would find that they would probably enjoy it, because the humor almost feels like it is like the origin of like Tim and Eric and or Xavier or hell, Tropical Cocktails, or even the Eric Andre Show. It feels like the origin of that kind of humor, because it's just so weird and dry and disgusting and bizarre. I highly recommend The Worm Eaters, specifically to people who like shows like Tim and Eric, because holy hell is it something to behold.
Follow the dead-end road to Mortville, USA.
Okay, there we go. At the number 13 spot, we have Invasion of the Blood Farmers. This is a movie I only watched last year, but it made it onto my list of my favorite exploitation films. And I rewatched it on the Blu-ray that I purchased at Cinema Wasteland, and the Blu-ray is amazing. I highly recommend you pick it up if you're a fan of this movie. Essentially, this is a movie filmed on a very low budget in upstate New York in the early 70s that is about a group of druids who are attempting to resurrect their queen, who has been in like a comatose and or undead state for a very long time. And they need blood in order to do so. I can't really explain why I like this movie, because there are a lot of people who absolutely despise this movie and think it's boring as hell. I find it very engaging and interesting throughout the entire film. And it's a movie that, if you can really get into its weird kind of Manos the Hands of Fate-esque vibe, you can actually find yourself enjoying the plot and or getting attached to the characters quite a bit. I really don't know what to say about Invasion of the Blood Farmers, because it's one of those movies that really you have to see for yourself in order to know if you're into it or not. But if you're one of those people who unironically likes Manos the Hands of Fate, then this is definitely a movie you should check out.
From coast to coast, the Godfather here's gonna give you hope.
Up next is Ted V. Michaels' The Corpse Grinders. Now, I've seen a lot of Ted V. Michaels' filmography. Quite literally, I am only, I want to say 5 movies away from seeing his entire filmography, and still, this is one of my favorites from him, and it's also the first film I've seen from him. The Corpse Grinders is a weird, disjointed, almost surreal, low-budget horror comedy about a cat food company that, after meat becomes too pricey, they resort to robbing graves to supply the meat for their cat food. This movie is nowhere near as gory or ridiculous or violent as the trailer or poster might have you believe. I have the Blu-ray of it from Vinegar Syndrome right here, actually. And, I mean, look at that. That's the woman being forced into a fucking grinder. That's not what the movie is. I think this is... Let me, This is just Blu-ray. But either way, The Corpse Grinders is, I would say, almost one of my favorite movies of all time. There's just something about it. It's so quirky and weird. It's very similar to Invasion of the Blood Farmers. It's a movie that a lot of people aren't going to like, but I find a lot of enjoyment in. And that's why it's on this list.
If you are thinking of going into this house. Don't.
Okay, cool. I think that was 12, so this would be the 11th spot. I hope I'm right. Is Bloodsucking Freaks, also known as The Incredible Torture Show and Sardou, Master of the Screaming Virgins. This is a very, very sleazy, violent, ridiculous splatter film from, I want to say, the mid-70s. It was shot, like, in this guy's basement, with one of his basement being one of the major sets, over the course of, like, a couple of weeks. This movie is, by today's standards, it's still extremely graphic and sickening and disgusting and offensive, but it's not like you watch it and you don't take it as seriously as you would in the 1970s. This movie is very obviously, tongue-in-cheek and trying to be over the top and ridiculous. There's some bad special effects. There is a scene where this guy performs brain surgery on a woman, and he sucks her brains out through a straw. Like, it's ridiculous. It's stupid. But it's also pretty graphic at the same time. Because the thing is, there's graphic violence, and then there's, like, cheesy graphic violence. Because cheesy graphic violence, you take a bit less seriously. It's not as high on the scale as, like, extremely graphic rape and torture. But at the same time, it's still graphic. Like, whether or not it's cheesy, it's still pretty graphic. So it's kind of a weird scale to be on. I haven't even gotten into the plot of this movie. This movie is about a guy who runs a theater show where he essentially tortures women on stage, very similar to The Wizard of Gore by H.G. Lewis. But the audience thinks it's fake, but it's actually real. He also runs a white slavery ring out of his theater, and after a critic refuses to accept his performance of this show as art, he kidnaps the critic and tortures him, and also kidnaps a ballerina. It's over the top, ridiculous. It's also a dwarf-sploitation film, with there being a dwarf character in the film, who most notably appeared in the porno film The Anal Dwarf, which is quite the classic, I hear. Either way, this movie is distributed by Troma, and it is the only movie on their catalog that President and founder Lloyd Kaufman has said he regrets picking up the rights to. Either way, this movie is ridiculous, over the top, violent, and I highly recommend it to anybody who wants a good, sleazy piece of 70s exploitation film. Because honestly, this might be one of the greatest, if not the greatest, exploitation film of the 1970s.
The ultimate in screen terror. The horror that was the Nazi nightmare explodes on the screen.
Up next, we have the horror thriller film Axe. Now, the thing is, this movie is considered by quite a lot of people to be a bad, boring film, and I can understand why. It's very low budget and very cheap, very low rent. I can completely understand why people aren't fans of it, I guess. But at the same time, going into this film, I had heard nothing but negative things about it. Like, I had heard nothing but, this movie is boring as hell, you're not gonna enjoy it, it's gonna be stupid as hell. The original title of the film is actually Lisa, Lisa, which I feel like is a better title. Essentially, this is a movie about a group of criminals who are looking for a place to hide out after they commit a series of murders. And they choose this isolated farmhouse, inhabited by the titular Lisa and her pretty much comatose grandfather, who she takes care of. Throughout the film, they kind of abuse Lisa and everything, and then towards the end she gets a bit of revenge. This is a movie I don't necessarily consider to be bad, but because it's extremely low budget and cheap, I kind of have to. This is one of the only movies on the list that I think I could actually recommend as like a legitimately good piece of cinema, because considering the budget and everything, it's a pretty well done horror thriller film. The original titles of the film obviously were Lisa Lisa. I think one of the working titles was California Axe Massacre. Both of those titles I think work fine, but I think the title of just Axe works fine. It very much leaves you in the dark on what the film is about. That being said, I highly recommend Axe, but I highly recommend you go in with low expectations, because I feel like going in expecting it to be bad will increase the, will bring the goodness of the film to the surface, I think.
This holiday season, prepare to have the stuffing scared out of you.
Up next, we have the only horror film, or at least the earliest horror film to be fully endorsed by the Church of Satan. I'm talking about The Devil's Reign. This movie is directed by the same guy who directed, I think he directed both of the Dr. Phibes movies, which those movies are legit great, honestly. Like, those are actually really good pieces of horror cinema that I would highly recommend. This, however, is a disjointed, confusing mess that actually ruined the director's career. It features none other than William Shatner and Ernest Borgnine in the fucking cast. Now, William Shatner, everybody knows from Star Trek, but Ernest Borgnine, people might not know. He was Penguin in the 60s Batman, and he was also the voice of, I'm trying to think of who the character was, Mermaid Man on SpongeBob for quite a while. He was in a few other movies. He was in The Wild Bunch, which is the only good film directed by Sam Peckinpah, in my opinion. But he's actually somewhat of an accomplished actor. He actually was also in Deadly Blessing, which is a pretty cool movie as well. But this movie is an absolute mess, and that's kind of why I love it. It's also the first film to feature John Travolta. He's in a bit part, but John Travolta is in the movie, and it's his first on-screen credit, or at least one of his earliest, which I think is hilarious. Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan and author of the Satanic Bible, is also in the film. Essentially, this is a movie about a guy who faces off against a servant of the devil, that servant being Ernest Borgnine, the main character being William Shatner, who commands an army of eyeless, satanic zombies. It's weird and ridiculous and over the top. It's a movie that I think I can only recommend to people who are actually really into bad movies, because I attempted to watch this with my friends when we had a bad movie night for my birthday last year, and they weren't really into it. Like, they were kind of bored by it for the most part. To be honest, we did watch it right after watching Hobo with a Shotgun, which is ridiculous and over the top. But in all honesty, The Devil's Reign is a really entertaining movie, and it's also the second movie from the 1970s, well, the second movie from the 1970s where a 60s Batman villain portrays the devil. Let that be known.
This year, there will be no leftovers.
Up next on the list, we have The Devil's Reign. Not The Devil's Reign. What the fuck am I doing? I've been drinking too much, and by sitting here, I've been letting my beer get warm. Either way, up next is Flesh for Frankenstein, also known as Andy Warhol's Frankenstein. This is my favorite version of Frankenstein ever. Let that be known. Also, Nicholas Winding Refn, the director of Drive, is a fan of this movie. Flesh for Frankenstein is a weird, violent, bizarre, incest-filled adaptation of Frankenstein, where the Baron Frankenstein, portrayed by Udo Kier, is in an incestuous relationship with his sister, who he has children with, and he lets the children watch them fuck through peepholes in the wall. And he wants to create a monster, a subject of a perfect Serbian kind of heritage, I guess. Two of them, so that way they can fuck and create a master race of zombies. This movie is ridiculous, over the top, pretty gory, and it features Udo Kier giving the performance of a lifetime. I love Udo Kier. Let that be known. I love this man. He's amazing. And this is probably his best performance. It's comparable to, like, Tommy Wiseau in The Room, honestly. I think it's better than Tommy Wiseau in The Room, to be completely honest with you. I think that just might be the fact that this movie is a gory, weird horror film as well, but that's making me, overweigh it, but either way. I don't know what else to say other than it features the line, "To no death, Otto, you must first fuck it in the gallbladder." Well, that's a line in the movie. I don't know what else to say, man.
What you are about to see did happen.
Up next on the list is the previously mentioned, when talking about Bloodsucking Freaks, the previously mentioned film, The Wizard of Gore. Arguably one of Herschel Gordon Lewis's best movies, and definitely one of my favorite movies of all time. The Wizard of Gore is a pretty ridiculous, over-the-top, violent horror film about a magician who seemingly has magic powers as he tortures women on stage. There's one scene in particular that I will always remember where he cuts a woman in half with a chainsaw, but there's no box around her or anything, and it's a pretty graphic movie, even by today's standards. They use like 3 whole sheep carcasses to do all the gore in the film. It's a bit ridiculous and over the top. It's the acting is very laughable, pretty bad in all honesty. The guy who portrays Montag is amazing in my opinion, though. I think he's very good at being really over the top. Very similar to the guy who was fucking Ramses in Blood Feast. Either way, this is a bad movie that's very different from the rest, because while it is pretty laughable and entertaining, it's also kind of a different bad movie. It's not like Plan 9 necessarily, where you can laugh at it all the way through and see the charming nature of it, because this movie was made quick and cheap to make a quick buck. It's not recommendable to everybody, but it's a movie I hold very dear to my heart.
Now, for those who have seen The Exorcist, Carrie, and Ruby, here is new unspeakable horror.
Up next is the first of 2 blaxploitation films on the list. I'm talking about Dolomite. This is like the only non-horror film on this list. Dolomite is the Plan 9 from outer space of blaxploitation films. It's so ridiculous, so over the top, and just amazing that it must be seen to be believed. Hell, even rapper and member of the Wu-Tang Clan, ODB, Old Dirty Bastard, even he was a fan of this movie. It's a ridiculous, over-the-top movie essentially about a black kung fu super pimp who is framed and put in prison by his rival, Willie Green. And in the film, Dolomite even sings his own theme song over the credits, and before he sings it, he says, y'all know Willie Green as the baddest motherfucker that the world's ever seen. Well, prepare to see the story of me. Yes, me, Dolomite. It's ridiculous and stupid. There are like 3 sequels to it, 2 of which aren't even sequels. They're just movies that star the same actor that have been billed as sequels. The first sequel, though, The Human Tornado, is amazing. I would highly recommend all of the Dolomite movies, and honestly, I'd put the entire series, that being Dolomite, The Human Tornado, Petey Wheatstraw, and Disco Godfather. I put them all at the spot, honestly, because they're all pretty enjoyable and amazing for the most part. I highly recommend them to anybody who is looking for a good time, because those movies are the definition of a good time.
A maniac is on the loose. A killer whose lust for blood threatens more than the lives of every pretty girl.
Up next is a film that I like to call the Hong Kong equivalent of The Toxic Avenger. This movie is The Oily Maniac. I covered this on my channel last year, but I've got to talk about it again, because this movie is absolutely fucking amazing. The Oily Maniac is a movie about a paraplegic guy who is, I think he's like a lawyer or something, in order to protect his girlfriend / childhood friend. She isn't like, you know, in love with him, or she doesn't necessarily want to be in a relationship with him, but he's attracted to her. He's essentially love interest and or childhood friend. He wants to protect her after his uncle, her father, dies. Or I think he's sent to prison, actually. But after that, he finds out about this magic spell to where whenever he covers himself in oil, he will become an unstoppable, cheap rubber suit monster with yellow glowing eyes that knows kung fu and can also turn itself into a living oil slick and move faster than a speeding car. This movie is absolutely fucking bananas and ridiculous. There's even a weird subplot thrown in that has to do with a case that he's working on. I'm pretty sure he's a fucking lawyer, where this woman was raped, and you even see that entire case happen. It's bizarre. It's weird. It's ridiculous. It's over the top. It's a bad movie I can recommend to just about anybody, because it's a bad movie that no one has really heard of or talks about.
A strange and gruesome story from the other side of life.
Up next is the second blaxploitation film on the list, Blackenstein. Arguably the best blaxploitation film ever made, and also the best blaxploitation horror film ever made. Blackenstein was made to cash in on the success of Blackula, which is actually a pretty good movie for the most part, other than the fact that it's titled Blackula. Other than that, it's actually a pretty good, somewhat creepy horror film. Blackenstein is a movie about a black Vietnam veteran who loses all 4 of his limbs after stepping on a landmine. And he agrees to be a part of this weird genetic experiment where they graft new limbs on to him and give him this medication that will help the limbs match, even though they're not the same tissue type or blood type or anything like that. When somebody mixes up the vials of medication they're supposed to give him, he becomes a 7-foot-tall Frankenstein's monster-esque creature who then goes on a killing spree. And yeah, this movie is pretty fucking gory for the most part. Like, there's surprisingly a decent amount of gore to the film. The effects are immensely cheap. For instance, the mansion that he's staying in is just the shots of it at night are just still images of it covered in a blue filter, and then the windows of wherever this action in the film is happening are painted orange. I watched this film with my mother, of all people, and she thought it was absolutely fucking hilarious. And the thing is, my mother is one of those types who doesn't really, vibe with bad movies that much. She enjoys, like, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, and that's about it as far as bad movies go. But she found this movie to be hilarious, and I think that is proof enough. that that this movie is highly recommendable to just about anybody.
White meat, dark meat, all will be carved.
Up next is another one that I have only seen somewhat recently. Like Blackenstein is fairly recent, the Oily Maniac is fairly recent, Dolomite is fairly recent. Like a lot of these movies on this list that are movies I've only seen in the last couple of years. But this next movie is Kathy's Curse. This is, I don't even know where to begin with Kathy's Curse. Essentially, this is a movie that attempts to cash in on the success of Carrie and The Exorcist by trying to combine the plots of both. But it's disjointed and broken and weird as hell. There's a version of it in the public domain that you can watch if you want, but the best version to watch, which I can't get to because it's like on a low part of my shelf, is the Blu-ray release from Severn Films. It's the best version of the film out there, honestly. They also released Blackenstein, which is a really good release, as well as The Devil's Reign, another good release from them. Hell, they also released Invasion of the Blood Farmers on Blu-ray, and Axe, all movies featured on this list. Either way, Kathy's Curse is a weird, disjointed movie that is one of those movies that kind of has to be seen to be believed. Essentially, this family moves into this house. It's like haunted or something. The daughter, Kathy, ends up getting possessed by some kind of ghost. And it just turns her into a foul-mouthed, kind of asshole-ish character. Kathy then goes around insulting people, as well as making them, like, hallucinate that snakes are on them and shit. One of my favorite scenes is specifically a scene where she encounters a psychic medium who is trying to stop the spirit that is possessing her, and she makes a ghost appear, and the ghost says to her, "Medium, more like extra rare piece of shit." What can I say about Kathy's Curse, honestly? Like, this movie is fucking art.
It's just a farmhouse and looks pretty innocent from the road. But once you're inside, you'll see what really happens on a terror farm.
The next two movies are movies you will find on my list of favorite movies of all time. At this spot, which is number 2, is I Drink Your Blood. Having seen this film recently with a crowd, I kind of realized again how much I love this movie. I Drink Your Blood is probably one of the most well-known exploitation films from the 1970s. Essentially, it is a zombie revenge film inspired by the Manson murders about a cult of satanic hippies who, after they rape this young girl in this town, her brother infects them with rabies, which results in them becoming zombies and killing, like, everybody in the town. It's weird and ridiculous and really over the top, and the violence in the film is something that I really have to comment on because it was the first movie to ever receive an X rating just for the violence, and I feel like, especially after seeing this with the crowd, the violence still holds up as pretty grisly and disturbing to this day. You know, there were audible gasps in the audience when specifically when they, in the famous abortion scene of the film. You know what I'm talking about, you've seen this movie. Either way, I Drink Your Blood is an absolutely amazing piece of cinema, and just one of my favorite movies of all time. It's a movie that when I first watched it, I didn't like it very much when I watched it when I was a teenager. As I've grown up and rewatched it multiple times, I've really grown to love I Drink Your Blood, because it's one of the few 70s exploitation films that really holds up as disturbing and violent and disgusting, and it also really just holds up as, like, being a ridiculous movie, because, you know, there are exploitation films from the 1970s that had crazy ass trailers that weren't really that memorable. I think one that pops into head immediately is I Dismember Mama, which I haven't seen all the way through, but I've seen most of, and that movie is pretty forgettable for the most part. But the trailer for it is really good. Also, it's also The Blood Spattered Bride. That movie again is one I really like, but it's not the greatest movie ever made. It's not, nor is it like as crazy and disturbing as it might have been considered in the 1970s. Either way, my beer is getting warm, and I'm running out of space on my fucking memory card.
In what Playboy magazine calls the most gruesome epic ever unleashed.
For the film in the number one spot, I'm switching from beer to something a little more girly, a little more classy, going with a Smirnoff Red, White, and Berry. This is not some obscure beer. This is a pretty well-known kind of summer limited edition version of Smirnoff that tastes like a bomb pop. Oh, that's good. At the number one spot, we have another movie that I consider to be one of my favorites of all time. And this is one that I discovered within the last about 2 or 3 years. It is a movie called Malatesta's Carnival of Blood. I featured this on my list of favorite bad movies of all time as well. And I just gotta talk about it again. I reviewed this on my channel years ago, too. This is a very weird, disjointed, broken mix of Herschel Gordon Lewis gore, Carnival of Souls surrealism, and the Night of the Living Dead, and pretty much any horror film set inside a theme park and or carnival. This is a movie that you will never in your entire life be able to successfully interpret how the film works based on just the plot. You know, for instance, you listen to the plot of Halloween, and you pretty much know what the film is going to look like, how it's going to function, and just how it all flows together. And you're going to know, essentially, how the film is going to work out. But you listen to the plot of Malatesta's Carnival of Blood, and you necessarily expect something specific. You expect a certain kind of movie when you hear the plot of this movie. For instance, I expected a kind of interesting zombie-ish kind of flick. I did not expect an unintentionally surreal masterpiece of horror that is also poorly made and cheap as hell, but has some really cool set design. I haven't even gotten to the plot yet. This movie is about a family who decide to start working at this old carnival, which the film was shot at an abandoned amusement park. They decide to start working at this old carnival after their son goes missing at the same theme park and or carnival. And yeah, I don't know how to really piece this film together. It features the actor who was Tattoo in Fantasy Island to start. That's something that happens in this movie. Yeah, but they after they get jobs there, they discover that there is a group of cave-dwelling ghouls that live in caves underneath this amusement park, and at night they come out dressed up as carnival workers to kill and eat people. That's the plot. Now you are expecting something very specific. Like, if you think about that, that's a fairly straightforward kind of zombie and or slasher movie. But this movie really subverts expectations, and it's one of my favorite movies simply because it's very unintentionally weird and surreal. It has an atmosphere to it. It has a very creepy, surreal, dreamlike, nightmarish atmosphere that I can only compare to the likes of Eraserhead, for example, but simultaneously it is a cheap, low-rent horror film. And that's why I love it. Malatesta's Carnival of Blood is a movie that I hold very close to my heart. Also because it's from a one-time director. I'm more than certain I featured this on my list of movies from one-time directors, list of horror films from one-time directors, but in all honesty, this film is amazing. If you're in the right mood for it and if you're the right kind of person for it. Either way, this is Biscuit Boo Horror Reviews. Thank you if you made it this far into the video, if you actually tolerated my drunken mumbling. Signing off. Peace.